thank you for being here for this debate, which I think is one of the most important when you're talking about the digital world. But first, I would like to give 1 minute for each one to introduce yourselves. So starting Nuno, you're the most known here.
Yeah, sure. Not at all, I believe. So I'm a senior associate at Cuatrecasas. I'm a lawyer. I work a lot and for a long time in the ecosystem, not only blockchain, but also emerging technologies. I was supposed to be an electrotechnical engineer that fall into this deep space that is being a lawyer, so the world of laws. It's somehow similar, but a little bit different as well. So, and I'm also the president of the Portuguese Blockchain Association, so I try to do a lot of public speaking about blockchain and blockchain usage, not only crypto assets, but DLTs and blockchain as a technological layer that works above the internet. And yeah, I try to do a lot of lobbying as well, legal lobbying to promote the industry.
Andy?
Thanks, Maurício. Oh, we on? Yeah, thank you. Yeah, hi everyone, it's great to be here. Thanks very much for the invitation. I suppose I'd grandly like to think for 40 years I've been trying to keep people safe. And I say that from the perspective that 30 of those 40 years I was in law enforcement in London. And when I retired back in 2017, I was head of a counter-terrorism operations. And that was dealing with terrorists during, I suppose, when the conflicts were in Syria and Iraq. So some of the most high-risk type scenarios. And before that, I was in organised crime. What I would say is for the first 30 years of myself, for the first 20 years of my service, actually most of that was very much in the physical space when I was trying to keep people safe. Because when I joined the police, there were no mobile phones, there wasn't the internet. And actually keeping people safe was more about understanding what risks they faced, trying to warn them about the risks, trying to get them situationally aware so they wouldn't get involved in too much risk or be at too much threat. And if something did happen, just getting there and dealing with it. Now that all changed a bit when the internet came in, and certainly for the last 10 years of my service and the 8 or 9 years since, things have changed. But I haven't changed how I'm trying to keep people safe. I'm trying to make them situationally aware. And probably one of the big challenges we're going to talk about is how do people really understand what they're getting themselves into when they go into that online space. So that's a quick resume. I'm the cop in the middle.
Jorge.
Well, hello, good afternoon. My name is Jorge Carvalho. I've spent 25 years of my life working in national security, intelligence. I still do, in a certain way. Information security is also something I like very much. But my biggest worries basically are now continuously security problems. And I share with Andy's preoccupations regarding risk and risk analysis. And basically that's what I'm going to try to focus on today.
Okay, thank you very much. So let's go for the point. You know, in the digital world and blockchain, you have always a big confusion sometimes between privacy, the notion of privacy and the notion of anonymity. But with blockchain, the rise of blockchain technology, how do you see anonymity, online anonymity, as an asset or as a threat to society? Andy?
Yeah, this is a really interesting one because I think there's semantics is involved here. So what I mean is words, it's just about words. And of course, I've had to obey the law and enforce the law pretty much for all of my life now. And there are lots of laws that tell you you've got a qualified right to privacy. And I would support that 100%. I'd stand on any hill and shout, everybody's got a right to privacy, as long as you act within the law. Now, I'm really struggling to find any laws globally that says you've got a right to anonymity. And it's because of the words are a bit different. Privacy, yes, because you should have a right to keeping your interactions, your relationships, your business private for good security reasons, as long as you're acting within the law. And there shouldn't be any unwarranted intrusion around that. But anonymity tends to suggest that you want to withhold any identifiers that might allow people to understand who they're doing business with. And I think that's the problem that I have, that you just need to think about the words. And privacy, yes, anonymity, no, because it tends to be regulated And within a legal framework, when it's privacy, anonymity causes real problems from a legal perspective.
Okay, Nuno, but when you use blockchain technology, a great part of the technology is to provide that anonymity besides privacy. What's your thoughts about it?
Well, I don't really agree that the idea of using blockchain is to provide anonymity in transactions in all sorts of transactions, either financial or even information transactions. So blockchain by default is not anonymous. It's at its best pseudonymous. Even the Bitcoin white paper suggests that. That doesn't suggest, it says it clearly. So Satoshi Nakamoto, whoever it is or they are, we don't know, but at the beginning when the first blockchain was created and suggested to the audience, the idea of pseudonymity was already embedded into the chain. And what's the difference? Being anonymous, of course, is being totally a part of any kind of possible detection or correlation with the private information or a personality, let's say. Pseudonymity is not. It's just an abstraction. You create an identifier that can be always correlated to some individual. And blockchain is pseudonymous. So you either, even if you use, let's say, a public address, which is our sort of an IBAN, it's your account. That's the way you can identify and correlate that with someone. It's always possible to reach the owner of the private keys that control the transactions that move outside of that public address. So it's pseudonymous at its best. It's not anonymous. It's always possible to identify if we really must and if we need to identify at some point in the process of on-ramping and off-ramping, which is on-ramping is passing from the traditional financial system, let's say moving euros, dollars, any fiat currency into the blockchain for that purpose. About 99% of the exchanges throughout the world that are public and are not peer-to-peer directly, like BISC or other platforms like that, will require or demand some sort of QIC. Some will do it better than others, but that's another discussion. And at that point, you are already identified in some way within the blockchain environment. So after 3 years of using this technology, if you want to off-ramp, they will track, it's possible to track every single aspect, every single transaction that you have made in between. So blockchain is a very, very bad technology to use to launder money or to do criminal activities. It's a little bit unpopular opinion, but it's my opinion, and a lot of people that work within this area would agree with me.
I agree with that part, but my question is, what's the level of control that the state or the authority needs to have in order to control that transactions? For example, this is for Jorge more. If I send 10 euros in a transaction to my son in Lisbon, does the government needs to know about it? But if I send 10 million to him, which I don't have, by the way, but if I send 10 million, now the state or the government has to know it? Jorge, how do you feel about this?
The question is a tricky one, because in the end, it depends on the government and the state that you're thinking about. If you're looking for an autocracy, for example, the level of knowledge they will demand is increasingly bigger and more profound. So the 10 euros probably will be interesting for them. If you are thinking about a liberal democracy, not only money, but also information. Because sometimes we tend to focus too much on money, too much on financial transactions, but the main question for governments in general is information. And information, all sorts of, especially individual and private information. Meaning that, for example, as Andy mentioned, financing crime in general, not only terrorism, but all other crimes, is important. But information regarding the transactions, the people involved, the who, why, and how things are done, it's also very important. And therefore, you have a new space, digital world, that actually is it seems like a free space, but it's actually a borderless and lawless area to a certain extent. And that is what we should be discussing. Because if we let just the space being governmentalized, you will have different governments with different attitudes going forward. in that aspect. I think all of us will share that we would prefer to have a law-abiding government, or at least a system based on the rule of law, where you can appeal to courts and where things are identified, than other countries that actually act according to their own interests with all their objectives fulfilled.
Andy, please.
Yeah, just to add to that, I've actually done a lot of work with global regulators, and a lot of what goes on, particularly in financial transaction out there, is what should we report? Because all jurisdictions are required to report some sort of transactions. Now, there's thresholds, which might be an amount. So you're 10 euros, no. In some places, 150 euros for certain things, prepaid cards, things like that. Could be 10,000 euros, there's thresholds like that. But actually what I want to know about, with my former hat on, and I'm sure with yours, what's suspicious? That's what I want to know about. I don't want to know about the everyday transactions, because that's going to take too much of my time. My analysts will be working too hard to do that. What I do want to know is if a suspicious transaction takes place. So you want to jump back in now, don't you?
If I may, so I totally agree with that. I think that currently our anti-money laundering laws and regulations are very poorly done and put in practice. There's a study from the United Nations from 2011, I believe, that said that only 0.2%, it basically addresses 0.2% of efficacy, of effectiveness of the regulations that we have in tackling any kind of anti-money laundering prevention. So we are trying to kill flies with a bazooka. And the problem with the AML and all the QIC that is done on regular folk like us, and not on the big criminals that are still able, even with all this regulation, are still able to finance their activities and sell drugs, traffic people, selling guns and everything else. They are still able to circumvent this with the simple signature of a bank director, a very high-ranked bank director. So all these regulations is just a means to create some entropy to our lives, and it's reflected on the way that we do and deal with and barter amongst ourselves. And it's also very problematic, in my understanding, is that we are creating data and personal data honeypots, which are, we are building a lot of information collection on individuals, normal law-abiding individuals, that are easily hacked, as we know, by criminal hackers and black hat hackers, not the white hat, which are the good ones, the good guys. So creating all this structured, very minutious and deep related with a person, these data lakes, these honeypots, it's very problematic in my understanding, and we should rethink as a whole and as a society what the Financial Action Task Force is really trying to do with this and putting out forward. And if it's really necessary to do all this, and not like Andy said, which is go after the suspicious actions and the specific legal and criminal activities afterwards, and not the preemptive surveillance state that we are trying to achieve here. That's my opinion, my personal opinion. States, and this is a slippery slope in my understanding, to create all these mechanisms to have a surveillance state that even in democracies, with the rule of law, which you can contest afterwards. If anything goes out, we can go to the courts and say, well, someone got access to my information and it wasn't supposed to. But
okay, but you normally... You can applaud, no problem. But we were talking a lot about the financial transactions or other type of more suspicious transactions. Can we apply that also, for example, data sharing on social media? Do you see there's an importance to do so for this kind of transactions as well?
Comes back to law, because all the various jurisdictions have different privacy laws, they have different information and data sharing protocols. GDPR sounds great, but GDPR isn't so operable in other jurisdictions. All of the, going back to the Financial Action Task Force, they say you should share as widely as possible so that you can identify, and that's great, but sometimes you can't. we always come back to, what does the law say in your jurisdiction? And for goodness sake, please act by the law in that. What does the law look like in the bloc, the EU? But then you go to the UK, because that's a bit different. The US is completely different. Singapore, it's really, really tricky, and it's all based around law. And of course, we must obey the law. Yeah. There is a line in the sand, that's the law, and trying to work around this is really, really tricky. And you're quite right, blockchain's really good to help us with that, because you can actually follow it. And we need to think about the positives sometimes when we always think about the negatives around.
Definitely. One small trap for you, Jorge. Andy and Nuno talk about GPDR. Sometimes you see, blockchain is immutable. How do we reconcile that with GPDR, which sometimes you need to destroy or to raise the information? What's your opinion about that?
I don't think it's a big problem because in the end it works as an immutable ledger basically, and not being overwritten all the data. And as Nuno was explaining, we are creating with blockchain and other technologies. We are creating basically honeypots of information, and I don't want to be naive, and I don't want anybody else to be naive. Financial transactions for the states, they are important, but it's only the first layer. The only layer that counts, the real layer that counts for the majority of states, especially authoritarian states, is social control, and in a certain sense, internal security for those states. So information is the key, and those honeypots, they will have to get them. They will have to go for the QICs. If you know your client, if you have all the information about your client, even if it's one time, they will try to get it, just for social control. Because basically the majority of the countries I know that work at a certain level in the digital world, like China, for example, the levels of control are already very high, and they will use all that information for the sake of simple political control, social control. In the end, it will be a national security issue, it will be a law enforcement issue also, and it will be a financial issue. In a certain way, coming back for your question, blockchain will help. It will, because it's immutable, because if it's kept like this, it will give and if a state have access to this, they will actually have a longer period of information. They will have something that it's not compliant with GDPR. However, the principle in GDPR is if you accept initially a certain, if you do that contract by giving your information to a QIC, for example, you are in a certain way allowing an exception to GDPR. So for lawyers, that is basically the function where things are, where the legal framework of the GDPR is bypassed. Let's say it's your previous agreement, understanding the system of blockchain and understanding that it's immutable ledger. You are giving a previous authorization to eradicate your protection rights to your privacy under GDPR.
Nuno, your take?
I just wanted to add a point here because we are passing into, let's say, sort of talking about blockchain for freedom of speech and the correlation between anonymity and privacy for freedom of speech. We can always remember what happened in Canada with the truckers' whole dilemma. And I see it as very problematic if any government or any state, if in a determined period of history or time, if they can go after you and block your ability to operate and to live, because basically they can block your bank account if you just have a different opinion of that specific moment. So if you try to counteract that narrative, if you go against the grain in a specific moment in time, it's very problematic if the government has total control on the way you interact with society. There's a Cardinal Richelieu, everyone knows it, from D'Artagnan and Alexandre Dumas, said one thing that rings a bell about this. He says that if one would give me 6 lines written by the hand of the most honest man, I would find something in them to have him hanged. And that's very problematic if a government controls your life at the point that if you have a different opinion, and nowadays anonymity is even more important because of free speech, if at any point the government doesn't agree with what you are saying, even if it's right or wrong, that's not the problem. If someone doesn't agree with that, they can go after you and prosecute you. That for me, it's very problematic. I agree. It might be a qualified right, but human dignity.
Even if the government, for example, feels that, for example, that threats national security, for example.
I would say that human dignity trumps any kind of national security. In the end, we are all humans. We are all citizens, and national security at one point in history, it's just an opinion, of course. At one point in history, they have one understanding. At the other point, they might have other understanding. It depends on the correlations and the powers, the equilibrium of powers, geopolitical powers at the specific moment. But if it can be a slippery slope. If we create too many laws that allows countries to circumvent human dignity and privacy being a sub-component of human dignity, as recognized in all treaties about this as a fundamental right, we create a slippery slope when at some point the state can control all aspects of your life, even if you are a law-abiding citizen.
Andy?
I'll just say something slightly counter to that, Nuno. On the basis, very recently in the UK, we had a dreadful event where an immigrant to the UK killed 3 young girls at a Taylor Swift party. It was all over the news, huge, big news. That was escalated really quickly by somebody announcing their opinion online, not particularly privately, actually. It wasn't an anonymity issue. But what that did, that then formed as a catalyst for other people suddenly to have an opinion, which wasn't the right opinion, which then generates and generates to the point where we've got riots in the streets, where there's all sorts of disorder going on, ends up with 2,000 people who would not normally have probably come to the notice of the police, end up getting arrested for being involved in a riot. So this right to have your own opinion, this right to have access is great. Thankfully, because of the ability to track back through the social media, the person was identified and proceedings are ongoing at the moment. But again, it's that you're right, it's a qualified right. If you stay within the guidelines, you should have a right to privacy. I have no problem with that. The right to anonymity, to try to hide behind something, even if it's just giving an opinion, can't be right from a legal perspective, because the greater good is served.
Jorge, considering these 2 takes, do you think that it's possible, or it's an utopia, to reach a kind of a global consensus regarding anonymity and blockchain technologies?
Regarding the technologies...
And he's laughing already.
Regarding technologies, I think the problem is never the technology, but the use that people make of it. Going back to the opinions of Nuno and Andy, I really don't believe in anonymity. I'm more on the platform where Andy stands on, but for different reasons probably. I believe that throughout mankind, the evolution of mankind, we evolved through several regimes. Democracy is a transition state, probably the best of the worst, but it's nevertheless based on the rule of law and based on a possibility of the weak to defend themselves. It's not a system that protects the stronger, at least when it functions. And what we have now in the digital world, in the information society, is basically a lawless area, or with, like Far West, we were the generation of cowboys, Indians, and the sheriffs. And basically we have some sheriffs, we have some cowboys, but in general it's a free space where people can act. And in those free spaces where law doesn't empire, we have always the situation where the strongest and the fittest it's basically the law of the jungle, and those are the ones that survive, the ones that thrive in this world. Of course, I respect and I understand where Nuno is getting to, because systems have flaws, and even more open and democratic systems, sometimes they have their own excesses, but. I'm much more on the side of pseudonymity, for example, on the privacy without any doubt. We should be extremely harsh in protecting privacy, in protecting forms of pseudonymity, which is in the end, it's privacy, because when you register yourself, your QICs, whatever, you are basically in the realm of privacy. And anonymity brings back you to the Robin Hood with bad objectives, basically, in the digital world. And therefore, to be very honest, I think it's something that blockchain has to step away from.
So you are pessimistic regarding this global
I'm
consensus?
always pessimistic because I think that the current tendency is not favorable to democracies, basically not favorable to human rights. I think those are spaces in the world that are being reduced. Liberal countries or liberal democracies are becoming oases in this world. And basically all technology will, if it allows the conservation of information, of individual information, they will be looked at as honeypots once again for authoritarian regimes to maintain their power and control their citizens.
With this scope in mind, with this rise of authoritarian regimes, so blockchain can be an ally for those regimes in the bad way of using blockchain.
Well, I
What
try
do you
not
think,
to
Nuno?
see it as such. I see blockchain more from a libertarian point of view because I tend to see this unbalance. Well, let's look at Magna Carta to pick an example of something that is close to Andy because of his nationality. The idea at the beginning, with all the liberal movement against monarchies and authoritarian powers and regimes, was to give to balance the power between the autocrat, the king, and the people, the serfs. And the idea here is the same nowadays, even in democracies. So the idea is to balance what is unbalanced by nature, which is a government, even if it's democratically elected, and balance the control that any kind of government, either in a democracy or in a theocracy or whatever you wanted, or plutocracy, oligarchy, whatever, it's the way to balance everything. And nowadays, with all the dissemination of technology and everything else, I see blockchain, self-custody, self-sovereign ID, any kind of let me manage my own things, my personality, my wealth, my property. Let me be disattached for any wrongdoings that any kind of government, even in a democracy, might do or might try to do to attack me, to attack my freedoms, my natural freedoms and my natural rights as an individual that lives on Earth. So that's my point of view. I don't know if it's right or wrong, but I see it even on free speech. We can define what is misinformation or disinformation or what is right or what is wrong. It's not the job of the government to define that, any kind of government. It's a job for journalists, independent journalists, to investigate. If we don't agree with them, we go after them because they are not inattackable. We can always counteract ideas with our own ideas and let the people sort it out and have critical thinking. It's not the job of any kind of government, even in a democracy, to define what is right or what is wrong on free speech, let's say, because any kind of crime, the criminal code, is like a sort of an agreement between every citizen to define what is a crime and what is not, to kill someone, except in self-defense. So that's already constructed for millenniums. So killing another human being, it's wrong, and that's in the criminal code for a long time. So let's keep private property and basic freedoms like our own freedoms to say something, even if it's wrong, to keep it out of the equation and keep it out of any kind of tentative state control, in my opinion, because that's a very hard, slippery slope that we can trigger, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So we should not have laws giving that possibility to have any kind of absolute power in the end.
With
to
that,
anyone.
I agree with you. George, your take?
Well,
You're finalizing anyway.
I listened to Nuno attentively. I think you spoke like a politician and not so much like a lawyer. But nevertheless, just to go back to Magna Carta was signed, and sometime afterwards, the same king that signed it ripped it off, basically defrauding all the barons in the United Kingdom that signed that to defend their own privacy and their own respective homes. What I mean is, in a lawless world, and the digital world is actually, like the Far West, a lawless world, it's always the survival of the fittest and the strongest. And when you think about authoritarian regimes or other kind of NGOs, but terrorist NGOs basically, or criminal NGOs, basically you have, in the dark, you have very bad animals looking for you, looking out for you. The only way to fight them is having your own bad animal, which is the government, basically, of your society. If that government is controlled by you as a citizen, accepting, because there is no full liberty, basically, even on the free speech. You can say everything, but if you speak certain things, and if you say certain things to incentivize, for example, terrorism, to defend preposterous ideologies, the majority of democracies penalize those opinions. So even in the freedom of speech, it's not something that we can accept as citizens of a democracy, that we can accept exactly in a totally freely way. There are limits, and the limits are the contract between humans and citizens of a certain society. And that is basically what I'm trying to say. Basically, blockchain will be, coming back to blockchain, but blockchain will be something that could be useful if used in the correct way to protect privacy, to protect certain rights of persons in the digital world, but it could also be used and easily be used by other regimes, by other countries, by other governments, in order to persecute or to guarantee they have access for a longer period to a certain degree of information, of private information of citizens.
Okay, Andy, just to finalize, and then we go back to the questions from the audience.
So shall I try and finish on a positive note then? As you know...
You have a pessimistic guy here, so let's be positive
in a
from your
mid-round,
side.
maybe.
I'd always say as a cop, trying to be practical, because I had to try to make these opposing views work. At some point, there's the law's there.
That's why I put it in the middle.
Yeah, exactly. And that's fine, because I pick the bones out of the good and bad bits, both of those, but I need to get the law working to keep people safe. Now, I think one of the challenges that blockchain and new technology, not just blockchain, crypto, all of that, is that legally, the position is very different from lots of jurisdictions. We do need to have a much more standardized legal framework for blockchain, for crypto to work. And of course, that's always going to be challenging in itself. But I think overall, if you go back before we had all this technology, relationships were formed by trust. What we have to do is make sure that new technology is trusted. Before it's trusted, it needs to be understood. There's a whole education program needs to be done for people like me, in particular, who didn't understand technology, probably still don't understand technology too much. But I want it to work. I can see all the benefits. I heard the great presentations from here. I can see potential benefits, but I'm still not able to trust that technology. So if we can get to a position where we have a legal framework with a trusted tool that can verify and keep people private at the same time, I think we're moving in the right direction.
Okay. Thank you all for coming here, and a big applause for them, for the pessimistic, optimistic, and the referee.